The subcommittee will come to order. Chairman Poe got detained because of the weather, and I guess Texas isn't set up for equipment like that, de-icing planes. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record without objection. The hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record, subject to length limitations in the rules. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Chairman Poe for calling this hearing. It's such an important hearing to have in today's climate, and Ranking Member Keating, Ranking Member Sherman, and all other members of the subcommittee for gathering today to continue working on one of the most urgent security threats facing the United States. As we will hear from our witnesses today, the danger North Korea poses the world is more than just its rogue nuclear program and ballistic missile brinksmanship. Pyongyang develops other weapons of mass destruction and backs them with significant conventional military capabilities. As his pursuit of chemical and biological weapons show, Kim Jong-un commands tools of indiscriminate mass murder beyond nuclear weapons, and U.S. policy must be responsive to these threats as well. North Korea, one of only 6 countries that has not signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, is believed to have stockpiles of thousands of tons of chemical weapons, including sulfur, mustard gas, chlorine, sarin, and VX, some of the worst chemicals that mankind has devised. These agents could be delivered by a variety of North Korean weapon systems, notably the massed artillery deployed near the DMZ, which would place Seoul at extreme risk. Experts believe North Korea would not hesitate to use such tactics as a way to make up the deficiency in its aging military, and that such an attack could feasibly result in millions of civilian casualties in South Korea. Recent reports have also highlighted North Korea's continuing work on another long-standing WMD program, the production of biological weapons, including anthrax and smallpox. It has been known for some time that North Korea possesses the capability to produce anthrax for military purposes, and just last month, a Japanese newspaper reported that North Korea has begun experiments to load anthrax into ICBMs. Tellingly, this assertion is reiterated in the administration's recent national security strategy. The frightening truth is that we already have at least one data point to show that North Korea is ready and willing to use such horrific weapons to accomplish its goal. In early 2017, we all remember North Korean agents assassinated Kim Jong-nam, the half-brother of Kim Jong-un, with VX nerve agent in Malaysia. This operation proved to the world not only that North Korea has access to chemical lethal weapons, but also the willingness and the expertise to transport and apply them in a targeted and sophisticated manner. Partly in response to this killing, the White House in November announced that it was redesignating North Korea as a state sponsor of terrorism, in a large part due to Judge Poe and other members of this committee. An overdue step to remind the world that the Kim's unlawful regime is an international pariah, but the threat remains. To backstop its asymmetric capabilities, North Korea also maintains the world's 4th largest standing army with over 1 million personnel, accounting for almost 5% of its total population. North Korea keeps its substantial conventional forces in forward deployed posture, keeping Korea and also Japan under constant threat. For example, even conservative estimates place hundreds of North Korean artillery tubes within range of Seoul, able to rain thousands of shells per minute down on the metropolitan area. These weapons could inflict enormous costs on South Koreans and the 230,000 Americans living in South Korea. Combined with chemical or biological payloads, the costs would be unimaginable even in the absence of nuclear weapons. North Korea's conventional, chemical, and biological weapons raise a number of questions that are too often overlooked in the Congressional debate over our policies towards North Korea. North Korea's investment in these weapons may increase the cost of potential contingency and constrain U.S. strategic planning. They may give Kim Jong-un additional strategic options to escalate a conflict without using nuclear weapons and provoking regime-ending war. If North Korea truly wants to rejoin the international community in a meaningful and lasting way, the Kim regime will have to bring something to the negotiating table. Perhaps the regime's chemical, biological, and other weapons aimed solely at civilian populations might be a fitting place to start as we work towards the goal of full denuclearization. I look forward to working towards answers of these and other questions, and I thank the panel for joining us today to discuss this concerning topic. And without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the hearing record, and I now turn to the ranking member on TNT for any for any remarks he may have. Mr. Keating?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing today. One of President Obama's outgoing warnings to President Trump was about the threat posed by North Korea, and here we are. Today we're not talking about the nuclear threats. It's axiomatic, almost, the question theoretically that was posed to one of our first ladies once, saying, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the theater? But there are indeed other real threats posed by North Korea's non-nuclear weapons. As tensions rise and the rhetoric heats up about military options, we need to be having an honest, realistic conversation about the types of threats that we're facing from North Korea and the full range of options we must consider given the very real risks we face. Frankly, reports that the administration is considering, quote unquote, a bloody nose strategy in North Korea is deeply concerning. War is not a matter of bloody noses. It's human lives, constant uncertainty, long-term challenges in our investments to achieve some amount of security. And we know all too well that this investment can easily take a generation, because security is not just fighting the battle and then going home. It's also everything that comes afterwards. We know this because we're fast approaching 20 years of military engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's because the instability produced by war is itself a threat. The chemical, biological, conventional, and other non-nuclear threats posed by the North Korean regime are serious indeed, and it's our duty to come together in Congress to best ensure the safety of the American people. Whether we like it or not, if the President launches an attack on North Korea, we'll need to make a decision on whether we will give him the authority to continue that military engagement. U.S. Pacific Command Commander Admiral Harris, who I had the opportunity to meet with when I visited the Pacific and South Korea roughly 1 year ago, is one of those voices we should listen to closely when it comes to formulating U.S. strategy in North Korea. So when Admiral Harris categorized diplomacy as the most important starting point, we should be taking a hard look in Congress at whether our diplomatic options truly are being pursued as aggressively as we can. Because protecting the American people does not automatically mean sending them to war, or worse yet, all but inviting an attack from a hostile regime. Before jumping to the military options, we need to be clear on what they look like, and most importantly, the full range of diplomatic options that we have available to us. We need to be clear on our options, because the options we choose will matter tremendously to our women and men in uniform and to their families and friends. It will matter to families living across the United States wondering if they might live within the blast radius where North Korea has the ability to strike here at home. And it will matter to the generations forced to clean up the mess left behind by what would inevitably be a long and complicated conflict on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is likely not to go its way and follow international law on the use of chemical and biological weapons. It was not so long ago that another brutal regime used chemical weapons in the midst of a conflict. What does it mean to operate on a battlefield where chemical and biological weapons could be in play? What do the civilian casualties look like? Can these weapons be secured in the midst of an armed conflict? And if not, what types of proliferation risks should we consider? All this in addition to the concerns presented by North Korea's conventional forces. What could such a conflict breed in terms of the spillover effects into other countries? A military option should only be used when necessary and once there are no other effective options left on the table. So I'm looking forward to discussing our other options today, our diplomatic options. And I thank the panel for being here to help us in that endeavor. Congress has already passed sanctions to deal with the threats from North Korea. So where's the diplomatic follow-through? Where's our State Department? Where's our ambassadors? The United States still does not have an ambassador to South Korea in place. Our allies are not reassured that this administration's actions, and we're not even at the table as North and South Korea negotiate, even though our own security is also very much at stake. These are serious issues, and we have very little information to understand and properly counter these threats. So we need to take stock of what we do and what we have to do. We've long had strong allies and partnerships in South Korea, Japan, and so many other countries that are similarly concerned by the threats posed by North Korea. When we face serious threats of this nature, such as nuclear threats from Iran, what have we done in the past? We work closely in a coalition of partner nations. The women and men of the State Department have long been some of our strongest assets in representing the United States at the table to negotiate peace and to make it possible for Americans to sleep soundly at night. Under this administration, they have weakened our State Department and confused our allies. We should be concerned that once a leader, the United States is rapidly becoming a pariah on the international stage, and that does not make us safer. So I appreciate the witnesses being here. I hope to hear from you and what we can be doing, even in light of the challenging circumstances and alarming threats that we face. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Words well spoken, well-meaning, and hopefully well taken as we go through this. Being the chair of the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee and Judge Poe is not here, I'm going to turn to the ranking member, good friend, Mr. Brad Sherman from the state of California, who is the ranking member of the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee. And it's important that everybody knows that the two committees have come together on this important topic. Mr. Sherman, thank you.
Thank you. And for many years, our policy on North Korea is focused on its nuclear program. We have to make sure that we don't stumble into war, and I'm concerned about the rhetoric that sounds like it's adolescent boys at a junior high school. The idea that we could bloody the nose of our adversary without risk to the Korean Peninsula and the world is absurd. In today's hearing, I look forward to hearing from our panel on chemical, biological, and conventional weapons, but at least in my opening statement, I'm going to also focus on the nuclear. I've co-sponsored 5 bills, many of us have, that sanction and condemn North Korea, but I've also co-sponsored the No Unconstitutional Strike Against North Korea Act, because we should not, by presidential fiat, be conducting military, really go to war with North Korea. We need a strong military to deter North Korean action, but we also need diplomacy. And diplomacy starts with a reasonable objective. I'm old. I was here when North Korea had as one of its objectives just getting a non-aggression pact with the United States. We turned them down. Vice President Cheney imagined that we could have a righteous invasion of North Korea. Bad idea now, bad idea then. We might very well look at the Freeze for Freeze initiative. We could suspend our military exercises in return for a verifiable freeze on North Korea's nuclear and missile testing and production. And I want to emphasize the word production because I don't think China's gone that far in its proposal, of both nuclear material and missiles, but also chemical and biological materials. To reduce the biological threat, we can ask North Korea to affirm that it will remain in the Biological Weapons Convention. We should encourage it in public and agricultural dialogues to limit bioweapons, and as suggested by one of our witnesses, push a no first use pledge and give one ourselves with regard to chemical and biological weapons use. We need to prepare for chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons use in the Korean Peninsula because it may indeed happen. The idea that you can't reduce casualties from a nuclear strike because a nuclear strike is beyond our imagination in its horror is to say that there's no difference between 100,000 casualties, 1 million casualties, and 5 million casualties. Likewise, when we look at the chemical threat from North Korea, we estimated to have 2,500 to 5,000 tons of chemical agents. We see that the distribution not only to our troops, but to relevant Korean civilians of gas masks and more sophisticated countermeasures might well be the investment, not because it would render us invulnerable or our allies invulnerable to such an attack, but only because it would reduce casualties. Finally, we need two other points I want to make. One is North Korea may soon be interested in selling its nuclear weapons or chemical or biological weapons. Roughly 10 years ago, Israel destroyed a Syrian nuclear facility, which seemed to have Iranian participation. That was all North Korean technology. North Korea will not currently sell its nuclear weapons because it needs a certain number of weapons to defend itself from us, in their mind. But they will quickly, in a year, 2 years, 3 years, get to the point where they can afford to sell one or more nuclear weapons. They won't sell for a cost that a terrorist group can afford, but sovereign states can indeed produce $1 billion or several $billion if that's the asking price. We need to work with China to make sure that there are no nonstop flights between Iran and North Korea. I spoke to the President about this, President Obama about this, and he assured me that we were checking ships, but we have no way of stopping planes. China, however, can require refueling of any plane between those two countries. Second, we have to be willing to risk our trade relationship with China to get a level of cooperation from China on this issue that goes beyond the foreign policy decision that they've made. And if we're not willing to do that, then we're putting the profits of entities on Wall Street above the security of the American people. It's not something we haven't done before, but we continue to do it when it comes to the Korean issue, and I yield back.
Thank you for your comments. Next, we'll go to Mr. Shabbat, who used to chair the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee, previous chairman. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you're doing a fine job of it. Maybe not as good as I did, but really good. No, just kidding. It was mentioned that we're not a part of the talks between South Korea and North Korea, and that's true, but I would argue that those talks it's blackmail, it's fraud, it's a sham, in my view. South Korea is concerned that North Korea is going to screw up the Olympics for them, and North Korea is going to get everything they can out of this, as they always do. We've had previous administrations, both Republican and Democrat, who have been suckered by the North Koreans time and time again. They promise to give up their nuclear program. We give them food, we give them oil, and it doesn't matter whether we're in six-party talks or whoever. All the countries that deal with North Korea fall into line. We give them a bunch of stuff. They promise to behave. They don't behave. And now they have nuclear weapons, which now can threaten us right here in the continental United States. They have chemical and biological weapons programs that they're proceeding for. Their conventional weapons programs, whether it's tanks or the artillery system that they have, and how they can target Seoul and us for that matter. It's horrendous that we being the rest of the world have allowed them to get to this point. The key to solving this whole thing, in my view, continues to be China. China talks a good game. They act like they're going to do things. They're going to cooperate and rein in, and they get embarrassed by the regime, the North Korean regime, on occasion. But they're not going to rein them in. They're helpful to them. They keep us and our allies off balance. And so even though they act like they're very disappointed, in general, what North Korea does benefits China as much as it keeps them off guard to some degree. China is the key, and as long as China believes that we're not going to be serious with them about cutting them off, basically, they benefit one heck of a lot more from trade and a relationship with us than we do from them. And until we get serious, previous administrations never got serious with China. I think there's at least a chance for this administration. I do believe this president, went into it being very tough with China, and he listened the Chinese leadership, and I think he's been too gullible, really, in believing what they're saying, and they pump him up and act how great he is, and he listens, unfortunately, and that's really is unfortunate, because this administration either gets tough with China, who can lean on North Korea and get them to back down, or they don't, in which case we have a nuclear North Korea now, and one of these days something will happen, which the world will regret. So we're way past too late, but let's hope too late isn't here yet. I yield back.
Thank you for those comments. Next, we'll go to Mr. Connolly from the state of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I echo what's been said. I was in Korea last year and went to the DMZ, and what really struck me was that the DMZ is to Seoul what Dulles Airport is to Washington, D.C. It's virtually that close.
Yeah.
And so we need to be careful when we saber rattle, when we tweet, when we throw out threats, because it unsettles that part of the world. We have to be careful about how that's interpreted by the North Korean regime and how it can sometimes inadvertently strengthen that regime and its resolve to develop nuclear weapons. But most importantly, that there are 25 million people who live in Seoul who will be the first victims of a violent outbreak. The second victims will be in Japan. And so we need to be cognizant of that. That isn't to say don't be strong. It is to say, however, we need to look at carrots as well as sticks, points of leverage to try to engage North Korea, even at the 11th hour, to try to get them to desist. And I think that ought to be the paramount goal of U.S. policy in the region. Stay strong, but be willing to be engaged. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Mr. Joe Wilson from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The totalitarian regime in North Korea continues to threaten the United States and our allies by testing nuclear capabilities and intermediate to long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles. We will not and should not tolerate the escalation by this rogue regime in North Korea. I'm encouraged by the leadership of President Donald Trump, Ambassador Nikki Haley, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, with Deputy Secretary of State John Sullivan for their commitment to demonstrating peace through strength, clearly expressing their commitment to keeping all options on the table when it comes to addressing the threat from North Korea, whether it be military, diplomatic, or economic. We have a responsibility to protect families across the globe, but especially those of America, South Korea, and Japan from this existential threat. As one of only 2 members of Congress who visited Pyongyang, I saw firsthand North Korea's fragile economy. Buildings without electricity, highways that were virtually empty, inflammatory propaganda posters threatening the death to South Koreans and Americans, and an international airport that was scarcely used. When contrasted with the vibrant capital of South Korea, it is clear that the communist regime of North Korea is fragile. That is why I believe the sanctions on North Korea promoted by President Trump have been successful, resulting in recent talks between North and South Korea, and North Korea agreeing to attend the Winter Olympics for the first time since 2006. I am grateful that President Trump is heeding the advice of military leaders led by Secretary of Defense James Mattis in taking the threat from North Korea seriously. The United States is fully prepared to handle this threat, and with the leadership of President Trump, Ambassador Nikki Haley, House Republicans, and Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Ed Royce, we will be even more prepared in the future. I yield back my time.
Thank you for those comments. Next, we'll go to Ms. Ann Wagner from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank both chairmen for hosting this important hearing today. Despite international pressure and a host of new sanctions, North Korea continues to develop nuclear weapons. But this should not be our only focus. We know that North Korea is not only miniaturizing a nuclear warhead for placement on a ballistic missile that can reach the continental United States, but also developing offensive chemical and biological weapons. These weapons are agents of terror and change how we approach strategies to confront the North Korean regime. Meanwhile, our partners in the West appear blind to the chemical weapons attacks by enemies of freedom across our globe. Just this past weekend, There were reports of a chemical gas attack in Syria that injured civilians. The United States must take a clear stand against the use of chemical and biological weapons and find pathways to disrupt North Korea's weapons of development. I look forward to your testimony and the questions that will ensue. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. Next, we'll go to Mr. Dan Donovan from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With so much focus on North Korea's growing nuclear weapons program, this hearing brings to light an alarming aspect of North Korea's arsenal that's ignored in the public discourse. North Korea has a disquieting stockpile of conventional, chemical, and biological weapons, which could proliferate to terror organizations and pose a threat to our homeland. I held a hearing on this topic just last month as chairman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications. So the information that we will gather here today will be enormously helpful for our ongoing Homeland Security activities. According to public documents and the Congressional Research Service, the U.S. may need to deploy up to 700,000 troops in the event of hostilities on the Korean Peninsula. That's several times more than the troop levels we deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Further, the Pentagon estimates that 20,000 civilians in South Korea alone could die each day of a war, all before the use of nuclear weapons by North Korea. This is an incredibly dangerous situation, and that's why I'm eager to learn from today's hearing. What we hear today will be useful to foreign policy, military preparedness, and Homeland Security. It's our role as members of Congress, to apply this knowledge to strengthen America's defenses, and I thank the witnesses today for sharing their expertise with this panel and look forward to hearing your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Garrett from Virginia.
It's 2018, and we're shocked as a nation to learn that slavery is still practiced in areas of the world, and yet a player on the international stage and in the spotlight, North Korea, is in the business, as it were, of literally selling its citizens into slavery. With this being the case, can we have any doubt that North Korea would engage and employ weapon systems that would wreak havoc upon civilian populations? In fact, by my understanding, the population of Seoul is roughly 8 million. The metro area is closer to 24 million, and having spent time as a fire supporter and understanding the proper employment of cannon, rocket, and missile fires, and understanding history and the fact that 2/3 of all combat casualties inflicted by the United States military since the Civil War were inflicted with indirect fire, 20,000 civilian casualties a day seems mild, and the question as to whether a regime that would sell its own people into slavery to line its thinly lined pockets would use these weapons against foreign civilians seems not to be a question at all. But I think these very people who we seek to protect in the interest of humanity and human rights are the key, and I would look forward to hearing from you how the individuals who might employ these conventional weapon systems might be targeted so that we might see a better humanitarian circumstance and a safer world for all in Korea and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Mr. Dana Rohrabacher from California.
I've been listening to everyone's comments. I had to grab a sandwich. That's all I had all day. Let me just note just some reaction to some of my colleagues. With all due respect, we're talking about the worst god-awful dictatorship in the world, and we're finding our time, however, our focus on attacking the President of the United States. No, I don't care. This guy is our president. Yeah, he's got some eccentricities. You think you're going to make war any less by attacking him instead of the enemy? Instead of this guy who has murdered his own family and murdered countless people to maintain power in Korea? No, these insults to our president, we should know when to make them and when not to. This is not the hearing to make those, especially considering the fact that what we have now is this very same communist dictator in South Korea talking about how to cooperate, at least with the Olympics. Seems to me the president calling him Rocket Man, and I got a bigger button to push than he does, maybe had the positive impact, because that's what happens with gangsters. If you deal with them forcefully and you put them down, they will respond to that. Let me just note, the Democrat response, when I first came here, which was a long time ago, during the Clinton administration, what was their response? Their response was to give $4 billion in order to curry favors with that dictatorship in North Korea. We gave them $4 billion worth of fuel. What do you think they used that $4 billion for? That's where they got the money to develop their nuclear weapon right now. Yeah, of course, people attacking our president, even after the last president, gave $150 billion to Iran. Oh, yeah. Now, I'm sorry, this was not the place to attack the President of the United States. And yes, we should be able to be critical of policy, but everybody knows his eccentricities and personality. You're not doing any good for our country or the cause of peace in a situation like this. That will make sure that the dictatorship in North Korea knows that our president doesn't have support.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
given the fact that my friend from California just went way over time, I would ask 30 seconds to respond.
I would rather wait to the end. I'd like to get to the witnesses for the respect of them.
Well, the gentleman has
I
just-
would request that he be given the extra 30 seconds to refute me. He always does.
We'll do 30 seconds.
I thank
We need
my
to get on
friend.
for the
I thank my friend.
benefit of the witnesses.
I thank my friend. I find it ironic that in the midst of criticizing people for criticizing Mr. Trump, my colleague then goes on to criticize previous presidents, all Democrats. I would simply assert that in a democracy, we get to criticize an administration, and thank God for that. That's a right not allowed in the North Korea regime. It is one still allowed here, and I and my colleagues on this side of the aisle intend to exercise it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for pointing that out, because around the world we see so many people don't have that voice of dissension, and that's something we are blessed with in this country. Any other members seek recognition? Hearing none, we'll go to our witnesses. Starting with the panel, Dr. Anthony Cordesman is the Arleigh A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He previously served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the State Department, and we thank you for your long public service to this country. Mr. John Paracchini is the Director of Intelligence Policy Center at RAND Corporation. Previously, Mr. Paracchini served as Executive Director of the Washington office of the Monterey Institute of International Studies Center for Nonproliferation Studies. Look forward to hearing from you and all the other ones. Mr. Anthony Ruggiero is the Senior Fellow at the Foundation of Defense for Democracies. Prior, Mr. Ruggiero was a Foreign Policy Fellow for Senator Marco Rubio, served in the Department of Treasury and State. And Ms. Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins is the founder and the president of the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation. Ambassador Jenkins previously served as the coordinator for threat reduction programs in the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation at the State Department. I want to thank all of you for being here, for taking your time to educate us. And out of these meetings come policy recommendations and ideas that we've seen implemented. And so these are very important hearings. And with that, you guys, I think, have been here enough to know how the light system works. You got green, yellow, and red. Push your button before you speak so the microphone is on. And Dr. Cordesman, we'll start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking members, members of the committee. We are talking about a range of threats which include two massive sets of conventional forces, each of which is equipped to fight unconventional wars in very different ways and in unpredictable scenarios. We have biological capabilities in North Korea. I would caution the committee that almost all of the open source data on agents, quantities, manufacture, and delivery systems are extremely unreliable, and that you should consult intelligence sources because all of what you see is, shall we say, inventive in ways that are perhaps discouraging. But certainly, North Korea is moving to the point where it can get biological weapons with nuclear lethalities. It can use infectious biological agents. The days in which you could control biological agents, I think, quite frankly, are over. The Australia controls, which once were controls, are now more of a shopping list and a cookbook in an international environment where very small and dual facilities can be rapidly converted. Chemical weapons lethality is perhaps much more questionable than many people realize, but it is also something you can easily manufacture and deliver. Within the other areas, you have precision-guided ballistic weapons, unmanned aerial vehicles, and cruise missiles. These can be used to destroy critical infrastructure, critical movement capabilities, and communications capabilities. And in Korea, this presents very special problems, both because Seoul and the greater Seoul area is so close to the DMZ, and because this is such a fragile country in comparison with many other countries. There also is cyber, and that too presents a problem. I think the point that I would make that the committee needs to consider, casualties and direct casualties are not a real measure of what war can be. What we have seen in Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Iraq shows that warfighting can have massive human consequences without using weapons of mass destruction. In the case of Syria, you've seen it move something like a third of the population, losing its home, its businesses, casualties which we can't count because of the number of people who've died. One of the members mentioned the population of Seoul. It's actually over 25 million in the greater Seoul area and over 10 million in the urban area. It is concentrated in areas near a massive set of artillery emplacements. The models I have seen generally only focus on tube artillery. I have no idea where the lethality data come from. Quite frankly, they don't make any sense, because there are multiple rocket launchers with far higher volumes of fire, and they can, at least in theory, use chemical and biological weapons. When you fire into a city, remember, people panic. They run, and they go outside the city. And Korea is a mountainous area with none of the spread and surplus facilities to absorb people we're used to. There are 5 other urban cities which are critical targets. You are talking about essentially 3 major container ports. There are 4 major airports. Each of those is absolutely critical to a country which is dependent on imports, which cannot provide its own fuel and generate its own electricity without sustained traffic, and which bears no resemblance to the Korea of the Korean War. Unconventional wars that move into these areas disrupt the economy, make people panic, create refugees and IDPs, are as much a risk as weapons of mass destruction. Losing food, water, and power can have the same effect. This is a country with the largest rocket and missile force in unconventional war that we know of. And if those become precision-guided systems, its lethality and war-fighting capability change as much as the use of advanced biological weapons. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate those grave warnings. Mr. Paracini?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the committee holding this hearing on this topic. Examining chemical and biological weapons in this theater has not been done in an open hearing like this as much as it should be, given the danger they pose, how they might be a catalyst to leading us to a nuclear precipice, and indeed how wrong assessments of those capabilities may trigger the wrong response. There are some distressing parallels with the situation in Iraq. Old assessments get repeated about new information, or there's no new information. There's considerable input from defectors, cooperating sources that are hard to validate. There's allied governments that face imminent threats and have reason to hedge against high-consequence threats if capabilities exist and if they might be used. A key difference between the Iraq and North Korean case is that the North Koreans have demonstrated they have nuclear weapons, and they are rapidly developing their ballistic missile capabilities. Another difference, though, is that we knew a lot about the past Iraqi capabilities, and then when we entered in 2003, we actually didn't know that much of their current capabilities. With North Korea, we know little about their past, and we have a very incomplete understanding of their current capabilities. But because most states with an industrial capability to produce pesticides have some capability, probably, to produce chemical weapons, we can be reasonably confident that North Korea has this capability and has tested and produced chemical weapons and has a stockpile. However, as Dr. Cordersman mentioned, repeated assessments suggest that there's an arsenal of a range of agents and delivery systems. But these are the same numbers that get repeated over the last decade and a half. Means of delivery include artillery, rockets, missiles, aircraft, and drones. But it begs the question that these same citations of capabilities have not been updated in the last decade, and it makes you wonder about their currency. However, there is a new development, and that's the recent assassination of Kim Jong-un. Other countries have used poison to assassinate regime enemies. But I think we can assess that this is also could be a signal by this regime that we have nerve agent and we're willing to use it. Biological weapons capabilities in North Korea, the assessments range from a list of agents that might number in a dozen or more to a limited program within existing industrial infrastructure to mere research. The potential of these weapons is great, and so it bears paying very close attention to them. But again, the evidence we have is indirect, circumstantial, based on third-party observations and South Korean government information, and some unclassified U.S. government statements. I think the best we can say at this time is they have the industrial infrastructure for a biological weapons program. They probably have the know-how, and they probably have done some basic R&D. The more disconcerting part that I think one of the members has mentioned is North Korea's history as a proliferator. It helped with the construction of a reactor in Syria. It shipped chemical weapons defensive gear to Syria. And indeed, it's helped with their missile program with some reported allegations that they have helped Syria configure ballistic missiles to carry chemical agent. They've also been a supplier of conventional weaponry to Hamas and Hezbollah over the years. There is no information that they have transferred unconventional capabilities to terrorist groups, and indeed, the empirical record does not show that any nation-state has done so. However, this remains an enduring danger that we have to pay attention to. So what can be done? Well, there are four things. We can expand the dual-use biosurveillance in Korea that would be useful for catching things like SARS and MERS, as well as an intentional biological attack. We can help other states enforce the robust set of sanctions that are out there. Many states don't have the capabilities to enforce these sanctions. We can help them do that. We can expand defensive measures. Dr. Korsman mentioned that. And finally, we can reinforce the taboo against chemical weapons and biological weapons by asking for a pledge from the North Koreans for no first use of these weapons. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to your questions.
I appreciate your comments. Mr. Ruggiero.
Thank you. Chairman Yoho, Ranking Members Sherman and Keating, and distinguished members of these subcommittees, thank you for the opportunity to address you today on this important issue. Before proceeding, it is important to state plainly North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's overarching long-term goal, namely the reunification of the Korean Peninsula under Kim family rule. While Pyongyang attempts to distract Washington and Seoul from this hostile intention, Kim always has his eyes on dominating the peninsula. North Korea's weapons, both nuclear and non-nuclear, are a means to an end, extorting concessions from Seoul and using nuclear weapons to limit Washington's ability to defend South Korea from North Korea's military provocations for fear of escalating the situation. Washington's goal is and should remain the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And the good news is that the United States can still act to counter Pyongyang's weapons programs. A combination of deterrence and coercion should be used against North Korea. The strategy would acknowledge the limits of each of these options, using them in combination to secure a denuclearization agreement, or, failing that, to weaken Pyongyang in order to diminish the threat it poses. Deterrence is essential to an effective North Korea policy. Yet American strength has not deterred North Korea from sharing its missile and WMD knowledge with other rogue states, nor has it prevented Pyongyang's race to expand illegal programs or engage in countless other provocations. The premise of the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy is that coercion must complement deterrence to limit provocations and create leverage. That coercion should take the form of an aggressive and comprehensive sanctions campaign. The good news is U.S. sanctions have more than doubled since February 2016. But the real test of a renewed and effective sanctions program is whether new sanctions are targeting Pyongyang's overseas business network and the non-North Koreans that facilitate that sanctions evasion. There's good news here, too. The Trump administration has sanctioned 103 persons since March 31st, of whom 74% operate outside of North Korea and 25% are non-North Koreans who facilitate North Korea's sanctions evasion, namely Chinese and Russian nationals. As the maximum pressure campaign has begun to show results, Kim Jong-un went back to a well-worn tactic of trying to drive a wedge between Seoul and Washington. In 2017, the only thing the United States and North Korea agreed on was that China's freeze-for-freeze proposal, where Pyongyang would freeze its nuclear and missile tests in exchange for a freeze of U.S.-South Korea military exercises, was a non-starter. In fact, Washington clarified that military exercises were defensive, so there was no reason to freeze them, whereas Pyongyang's programs entail violations of numerous UN Security Council resolutions. But with one New Year's address preying on South Korean President Moon Jae-in's desire for an illusion of peace during the Olympics, Kim changed the narrative from freeze to delay for nothing. For a mere promise of talks, Pyongyang received a delay of the aforementioned defensive military exercises. As Seoul moves into a period of negotiations with North Korea on its Olympics participation, Washington's policy should ensure that South Korean engagement in no way undermines the maximum pressure campaign. If there are signs that North Korea is only playing for time, the U.S. should urge an end to talks. Pyongyang and Beijing should not be allowed to violate UN and U.S. sanctions during inter-Korean talks. If at some point in 2018, a substantial improvement in Pyongyang's behavior leads to the prospect of U.S.-North Korea negotiations, Washington should learn from its past mistakes and insist that Kim Jong-un commit to denuclearize before talks begin. The United States must not allow Moon's desire for a deal and Washington's inherent need to move beyond this crisis to get us into another set of flawed negotiations resulting in a dangerous deal that locks in North Korea's weapons programs. Thank you for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your comments. Ambassador Jenkins.
Mr. Chairman, ranking members, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for inviting me here today to speak about North Korea's or DPRK's threats outside those of nuclear weapons. It is understandable that with the exchanges between the U.S. and North Korea in the past few months, that nuclear weapons are the focus of attention regarding the North Koreans' military capabilities. However, one should not lose sight of the fact that there are other significant military threats from North Korea. Today, you are hearing about some of these other threats, and they consist of North Korea's chemical weapons, potential biological weapons pursuits, and the overwhelming conventional weapons. And we have on this panel today experts on the various non-nuclear threats emanating from North Korea. So I will move on to discussing some potential diplomatic mechanisms to meet those threats. Addressing the DPRK threat is not a challenge that Washington should tackle alone. North Korean involvement in chemical and biological weapons programs are not in line with the international norms against development and use of those weapons, and should be part of a global effort to address those programs. Few countries have any contact with the DPRK, which limits opportunities for diplomatic exchange. Working with countries that do have that type of relationship, for example, Sweden, can be part of a planned diplomatic effort to engage North Korea. Of course, the key to any negotiations on North Korea's weapons will require North Korea to come to the table, which is a significant challenge. All of the following ideas had that caveat in mind. On chemical weapons, the general goal of the international community should be that the DPRK destroy any such weapons, regardless of the fact that the DPRK is not a party to the CWC. Any discussions with the DPRK on such weapons would require the engagement of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in regional states at a minimum. The DPRK should join the CWC as a state party and agree to destroy any potential chemical weapons with verification. We have witnessed with the destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons that the international community can come together to assist in that process. Regarding conventional weapons, the primary concern is the overwhelming number of such weapons possessed by North Korea. There should be a reduction in the conventional forces and more equality in the numbers and types of weapons with South Korea as a way to reduce tensions. In this respect, the two sides may negotiate an agreement similar to the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe Treaty, and both sides can reduce their conventional weapons to an equal amount in types. Such an agreement would require a permanent and verifiable means of destruction. The CFE can provide some thoughts on a way forward. North Korea is already a party to the Biological Weapons Convention, and as a result, it should not be developing biological weapons. Any activities regarding a biological weapons program should stop. Since there is no verification regime of the BWC, a small number of countries, including those in the region, may agree to a verification scheme. The Biological Weapons Convention Implementation Support Unit should be a part of any engagement with additional staff and funding for this particular purpose. These options lean heavy on a diplomatic effort and negotiations to address the North Korean military threats. Some rely on existing norms that reflect the agreement by the global community against the possession and use of such weapons. Some have conventions or initiatives that can serve as examples for engaging the North Koreans. However, any negotiation needs an element of trust amongst the parties. There must be some belief that the party on the other side wants to discuss the issues and has something to gain by doing so. If we want North Korea to come to the table, we must temper our threats with real possibilities for diplomacy. In this respect, it would be extremely challenging to convince North Korea to relinquish the weapons it believes it needs for its defenses or its domestic purposes. Moving the DPRK to join the international community that has already moved away from the development and use of chemical and biological weapons, for example, will take time, and it will need a continuous process. It is also essential that the international community walk the walk and talk the talk of actions that we want other countries to do, including North Korea. We also need to find a way to make any success from negotiations sustainable. We have seen in the case of negotiations with North Korea's nuclear program through the years that what is considered an agreement continually fails. How do we make sure that North Korea does not go back to business as usual? In each situation, there needs to be a mechanism to continue discussions and help verify that the North Koreans are living up to their agreements. In this respect, the North Koreans would need to be part of existing implementing bodies, treaty implementing bodies. There may be other options that we can do with North Korea, assuming we can move them from being an adversary to eventually being a party. This will all take time and a lot of real diplomacy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
I'd like to thank the panel for your expert testimony. Look forward to answering the questions. Dr. Cordesman, you talked about, as you pointed out, the number that we know is exactly that. It's what we know. It's what we don't know that really scares us, the unknown. And I guess that's part of, I don't want to say terrorism, but that's part of a hand they play. You know, it's what you don't know. Is there other techniques that we could do to get other countries to come on board? When I look at what's going on, you know, I've got information in here that's out there. In August, shipments of 30,000 North Korean-produced rocket-propelled grenades were intercepted on their way to Egypt. How concerned should we be about Egypt's secret arrangement to procure $23 million worth of weapons? Number one, that's funding North Korea while they're an ally of ours. This is not a U.S. policy. This is not a U.S. problem with what North Korea is doing. It's not a South Korean problem. It's a world problem. And if we have allies, especially ones that we're giving foreign aid to get them to the table, how do we find out more information and get everybody on the same page? Like, we have to get a resolution to this peacefully, ideally. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, I wish I had more optimistic conclusions, but a little over a month ago, I was in the Middle East. At a time, there was a supposed 40-country alliance of Arab states that was supposed to be cooperating in dealing with security issues. And quite frankly, I have never seen more hypocrisy in a given meeting than I saw there. I don't think you have any choice unless you are willing to embarrass allies and put pressure on countries, unless you can threaten not simply sanctions, but actually intercepting known shipments of arms and weapons. North Korea is going to do anything it can to find ways to export, to obtain technology, import, to do, if it can, simply exchanging the techniques of producing systems with other countries like Iran. Blocking that is something we can sometimes do in detail, but it requires an extremely aggressive approach. And yes, there are European allies, there are Asian allies that will work with us, but those are not the countries North Korea deals with. And I simply would not be optimistic about the prospects.
Okay, and I'd like to get somebody's thoughts on this. The agreement to destroy the chemical weapons in Syria was supposedly carried out and certified 100% by the world community. We realize that's not true. You know, there was still some left over. In fact, we just heard reports that the Assad regime may have used chemical weapons, including VX gas. Does anybody have any information on, is that true? And to think they came out, is there any proof that, is there any information out there that they could have come out from North Korea? And anybody want to comment on that? Mr. Parchini, I'm sorry.
So we're better off that chemical weapons were eliminated from Syria with the understanding that they had the possibility to both hide and make even after their stockpile was removed, because that meant fewer weapons that they could use against.
Do we know that they're making them, or are they getting them from North Korea?
So we don't know, even if they're probably, if they are getting chemicals from North Korea, they're more in the precursor nature, and they could be making new agent. But remember, a lot of what we've seen in Syria are attacks using chlorine.
Right, but just recently they said that could have been laced with VX gas. I don't know how you do that, or...
So Syria, in the Syrian conflict, VX has not appeared yet as an agent that's been used. Sarin has been...
Sarin
has been the nerve agent that's been used. But look at how they've used chlorine.
Right.
Even after they agreed to eliminate their stockpile. They've used a widely available industrial chemical as a weapon of war.
And that's a terrible chemical. I'm going to, just one more question. If North Korea is serious about earnest dialogue and coming to the table, would you recommend signing on to the CWC, the Chemical Weapons Convention?
So I'll offer a comment, and then Ambassador Jenkins may have some thoughts here. But
sure.
North Korea is the only member of the five-party talk, or the six-party talks, that is not a member.
Right.
So it stands out. So it's to our advantage to press them on this issue, number one. And number two, the global taboo on the use of these weapons has degraded since the Syrians have used chemical weapons. There's an opportunity to bolster that norm by pushing the North Koreans.
I think that's a good point. Ambassador Jenkins, you have a comment?
Yes, I would just agree and say that I think it would be good to have them part of the convention, because then they can be part of the multilateral and international negotiations that go on a regular basis. There's yearly meetings with the OPCW. There's activities that go on, and one way to help make sure that they're doing what they should be doing is have some kind of transparency and some kind of engagement. So I think that would be very helpful if there were.
Thank you for your comments. We'll go to the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's clear that one thing we should do is maximize our soft power that we could. And sometimes things appear from the administration to be disjointed. Let me give you an example. We had a new president. President Moon came to power. And one of the strengths we have, at least when I was there just a year ago, was the coalition we have with Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. It's at unprecedented levels. The cohesiveness was stronger than it ever has been. However, with a new president, our president threatened to pull apart the trade agreement with South Korea during that period. How could that possibly do anything but hinder our ability and cohesiveness as a coalition together, as a fundamental coalition? And how damaging were those comments and the timing of those comments? Does anyone want to address that?
I guess I would start with that. I would agree with you in what you're saying in terms of how those comments were probably received. I think one of the things that we seem to be lacking now is a much more of a coordinated approach in the way in which the U.S. government is really handling a lot of these issues. There seems to be not as much attention or force coming from the Department of State and engagement in the Department of State and engagement of the expertise in discussing some issues before they are actually made, in the policies before they're actually made and told to other countries. So I think that's created a bit of confusion with some of our countries out there, some of our allies out there. I know I often get questions regarding the way in which the U.S. government is perceived regarding the State Department and what's coming out of the White House. And I think that we don't have the coordinated message that would be helpful. It's good to have soft and hard power, but I think you have to have a way in which it's coordinated and it's seen as a whole. And so I think that when you have these kind of statements that are made in the middle of a situation where relationships are going very well, it does cause countries to take a step back and wonder what's going on. That's just my view.
Thank you. Does any members of the panel think that was helpful, the timing and the effect of that? Thank you. Dr. Kortesman brought a couple of important points, I think, takeaways that I had myself. We are focused on the nuclear issue and the missile capability, but every day on the border, there's scuffles and there's potential conflicts that can escalate at any time. In fact, our own military leadership there has said that they spend an inordinate amount of their time just trying to tamp those down because of that fear. That's one point. The other point that might come along with those lines is, again, an important point looking down the road, and that's potential refugee problems, should they occur. So, Dr. Kortesman, do you want to just extend your comments on your perception of how really threatening those border issues are on a day-to-day basis, how they could escalate? And then secondly, an interesting point that you did bring up in regards to if there is a conflict and there's refugee problems, they'll affect China. And, you know, are they factoring that in? Because generally China is not taking these issues as seriously as they should be from our perspective. And that's one they should look at what happens to the peninsula. Doctor?
I think we have, first, we need to be careful about the term border. We're talking about the DMZ, and the problem we have is it isn't just the hardened artillery sites near the DMZ, which go all along the DMZ. They're not simply near the center of Seoul. They're near an area with about 25% of the population or more of Korea just in the area around Seoul. So this is something where longer-range rocket systems can have a major effect. And we're talking about depths of perhaps 50 to 100 to 200 kilometers when we throw in unmanned aerial vehicles and cruise missiles, which are actually far better systems for delivering biological and chemical weapons than artillery is, because they're slow flyers and they disseminate in much more controllable ways. We also have some 25 tunnels. All of these things could produce a massive refugee population. And looking at Seoul and the greater Seoul area, there simply isn't surplus capacity, and it is remarkably hard for them to even move south, not in the numbers that exist today.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll yield back, but I will be following up with a written question, Mr. Chairman, just dealing with a common thread of how we have to improve our intelligence in that region and how maybe working with coalitions, that's something we should work on as well. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. I appreciate you respecting people's time, and if we have time for a second round, if you're still here, we'll let you do that. We'll next go to Mr. Joe Wilson, South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was grateful in September to lead a delegation to South Korea. Of course, we visited the DMZ. We were there in Seoul. We visited, in particular, Camp Humphreys. And it was really incredible to me to know the strong relationship we have with the Republic of Korea and their investments. The American people need to know the hundreds of millions of dollars which have been spent to build a world-class facility there at Camp Humphreys, truly indicating the bond that we have between the people of the United States and the people of Korea. Another issue to me, and I would be really interested in finding out from each of you what your view is, and has there been any collaboration on nuclear weapon or missile development with the rogue regime in Iran, between cooperation between Pyongyang and Tehran?
There is very good evidence of cooperation on missile development. There are questions among experts as to how much cooperation there is in specific areas, how much they're sharing, but it's been clear for years that there is an exchange of technology. It's also clear that some of the technology that's coming from Russia and from China has spread into both North Korea and Iran and is affecting the engines and capabilities for missile development there. I don't know of any evidence of cooperation in the development of nuclear weapons. There are reports of delegations being present from Iran at the test of North Korean nuclear weapons. Whether they are accurate or not, to be honest, one of the problems we have is a lot of media reporting, sometimes claiming it's coming from South Korean military sources, that is very unreliable. But to be honest, I'm not sure you would detect cooperation in nuclear weapons design. It's not something where you would have to be public or there would be easily observable signals.
I mean, I would say on ballistic missiles, it's important to remember that on the implementation day 2 years ago of the Iran nuclear deal, that the Obama administration issued sanctions against Iranians for their cooperation or their missile cooperation with North Korea. It just shows you the sort of level that cooperation was at. On the nuclear side, I think the concern here that I've always had is that what each side has fits really well in the sense of they both use very similar enrichment programs, enrichment centrifuges. Iran likely has a desire for both the design and some of the testing information that North Korea has gotten from nuclear tests, and Iran, of course, could pay for that. So that's always the main concern between Iran and North Korea nuclear cooperation.
And wasn't it proven that there was a direct relationship of North Korea with the nuclear development in Syria? But fortunately, Israel took care of that, and it may have even dispatched some North Korean scientists on the side. So this is such a danger, the collaboration of totalitarian regimes. Another question I have for each of you, and it's really frustrating to me that China has benefited so much from trade with South Korea, tourism, investments by South Korea in developing business and industry and opportunity for the people of China. On the other hand, DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is simply a dependency of the People's Republic. Why would they maintain such a dependency when they can see the benefits of working with the Republic of Korea?
Well, I think the relationship in that region is interesting. I would also add that the Chinese always criticize unilateral sanctions until they use them, and of course they use them against South Korea. Really to their own detriment. I think that the Chinese did not win in that. I think the Chinese are realizing that. I think the record on sanctions is mixed. The Chinese are willing to go after North Koreans inside of China, but they still remain unwilling to go after their own nationals that are aiding North Korea. And that's really and Russia does that, and it's the same thing with Russia as well on North Korea sanctions. So that's really the critical area that we need to get the Chinese to move toward.
Thank you very much, and my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, next we have Mr. Gerald Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Isn't my timing perfect? Yeah, perfect. And I have been watching and listening upstairs, so thank you. Ambassador Jenkins, you talked about using hard power and soft power. I was making the same point in my opening remarks. Could you elaborate a little bit? I mean, what's the soft power available to us that could be efficacious?
Well, it's interesting to use the word power in the situation of North Korea, because we are so limited in what we can do in terms of soft power. But I think there's a lot that we have not yet explored. I think for the most part, the situation with North Korea in that region has been very much a bilateral relationship with the U.S. working directly with each country. And we have worked very much regionally in trying to resolve the issues there. I think there are other options or other possibilities for working with more countries to try to see if there are ways in which we could address some of these issues. All of the things we're talking about today, whether it's chemical weapons or biological weapons particularly, are issues that are of a concern to the international community. They're issues that, as we have said already, there's an international norm against the use of those weapons and the development of those weapons. So I think that there are options to try to see how countries can start to work together to see how they can address the issues in North Korea. Of course, trying to make sure first of what they actually have, but also trying to see if there's a way that countries can work together on that issue.
So one soft power would be sanctions, correct?
Yeah.
Mr. Ruggiero, Governor John Kasich wrote Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. So Governor John Kasich wrote an op-ed piece in which he said, we haven't used all of the soft power with respect to sanctions that we could have. And he cited things like, more in-depth banking ties and relationships, getting really tough on that. He talked about insurance for merchant marines, fleets, so that shipping suddenly becomes vulnerable because we're denying them insurance if they're going back and forth to North Korea and the like. Do you believe we still have leverage that is meaningful that could persuade the North Koreans it's worth pausing, if not rolling back their nuclear development program? Because that's really the object here.
Right, I do. I think, this administration has gone after China, whether it's firms or banks or individuals, 7 times last year, but they're still pulling back. They're pulling their punches. And I think part of that is because they likely fear Chinese retaliation. When it comes to North Korea, I take your question as, how can you affect the revenue flows? And the good news here is that it looks like from the examples we have more recently, a lot of this revenue is inside of China. So you can start to affect that. And then North Korea uses that for what I like to call three purposes: military and obviously the security services, their weapons programs, and their elites. And right now they get to rank those 1A, B, and C. From my perspective, what we have to do is rank them 1, 2, and 3, because all of them are key to Kim's survival. And we're not talking about regime change, but we're talking about changing the calculus here.
Right.
And I think, going after Chinese banks, not cutting them off from the U.S. financial system or sanctioning or freezing their assets, but using regulatory fines like we did against European banks in the Iran sanctions context.
Which is a model. I mean, that worked.
Right.
Apparently that worked. Mr. Cordesman and Mr. Parashini, and I've got a limited amount of time, but what's your take on how much leverage we really have with respect to Chinese behavior? Can we really bring the Chinese to cooperate with us in a meaningful way? I mean, we talked about soft power, but I mean, for example, there are North Korean restaurants and businesses, that is to say, businesses and restaurants run by North Koreans who remit profits back to China. I mean, back to North Korea from China. They're operating with impunity. It's not like it's a secret. So is there more room, and what's the point of leverage we have over the Chinese to cooperate?
I think there's more room, but I think we need to be very careful. They will not take steps which threaten the existence of the regime in North Korea or its status as a buffer. They do not have the same strategic interests we do. And the cooperation can never be enough to by itself probably force North Korea to change.
Thank you. Go ahead. I'll let you finish up.
So I would add that the Chinese are very concerned about refugee flow from North Korea to them. And I have met with Chinese from right over the border. They are very concerned about that. And that may be an area of collaboration between the United States and China. But we have to be very careful about how we manage that, because should there be a collapse of the regime, China is going to be very eager to move first and make sure that we in South Korea do not move very far north.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Mr. Tom Marino from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Paracchini, am I pronouncing that correctly as an Italian?
Paracchini.
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 Rhymes with zucchini, which is a good vegetable.
Okay. You answered my first question that I wanted to ask, and let's expand on that a little bit. My question is going to be, and I believe this so because I'm a member of NATO Parliamentary Assembly and we discuss these issues, that China is very concerned about the North Koreans flowing into China because they do not want to have to take care of them. And North Korea is a buffer between a democracy of South Korea and the United States and China. Is that a fairly good assumption to make?
I think it is, and there's a long-standing relationship between China and North Korea and between China and Myanmar. And there's a special relationship there between those three countries that's hard to overcome given historical ties.
Do you think at any point, and I don't believe this, but if anyone on the panel believes that North Korea would get into serious discussions with the U.S., do you think that's possible? Anyone?
So I would add, we need to think about this as a long-term game.
It's been a long-term game.
NATO was in place until the Soviet Union fell for a long time. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, on the Korean Peninsula, we're in the same type of game. So the question is how to make sure it doesn't come unraveled. We don't have a hot conflict. As we've seen, the North Korean leaders do pass on. So we have to hope for moderated change. I don't think we should be thinking that they're going to negotiate and change. That leopard is not going to change its spots.
No.
So we got to figure out some way to navigate with them over a long term?
I mean, I would just say I guess I'm the optimist here, which is kind of surprising for someone who supports sanctions. But the optimist here that when it came to Iran, I mean, we could have conversations about the nuclear deal, but I think even critics and supporters of the deal agree that sanctions brought them to the table.
Yeah, but nobody was there protecting Iran per se. Iran. The sanctions, the economic sanctions, were doing well until we gave them $150 billion. But
right.
Aside from that, I don't think anyone else would have been coming to Iran's aid concerning sanctions.
Well, I mean, I would say, I've also worked on Iran sanctions when I was in the government, and I remember conversations about we couldn't go after their oil revenue, and of course that's what happened. So I think, when we're talking about the Iran sanctions model with North Korea and frankly China has never really faced what the Treasury Department could do with regard to North Korea sanctions, back to the prior question. So I think it's, from my perspective too, we also have to have a conversation of what would those negotiations look like, because my main concern is that those who support diplomacy fall back to we could get a freeze and then we can go through extended negotiations and North Korea will eventually denuclearize. I think you have to flip that on its head and insist that North Korea be committed to denuclearize up front. Not denuclearize, but be committed to that up front.
Okay. Doctor?
I think the committee should ask where North Korea will be in 5 to 10 years in its nuclear programs, its precision strike programs, and its biological capabilities. You mentioned a long-term game. In each case, they can edge around an awful lot of negotiating constraints and agreements. Yeah. And instead of just looking at what you can do that might work, I think you need to take a harder look at what will happen at the existing way that North Korea is proliferating and developing its weapons and technology.
I happen to agree with you. I think that's the first issue that we should tackle in any situation like this. Ambassador, did you have anything comment?
No, I was just thinking that we've heard a little bit about some of the uncertainties about what North Korea really does have in terms of chemical and biological, and I think it's a good time to think about what we can do now to try to get ahead of what we may or may not know about what they have. If in fact they're not at the point of having a biological weapon, for example, what can we do to try to work through that problem and that situation now?
Quickly, in 2 seconds, do any of you believe that China will take out the ruling family in North Korea? I'll let the record reflect that no one responded to that they think they will take out the ruling family. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Next, we'll go to Ranking Member of the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee, Mr. Brad Sherman from California.
Public sources have estimated that North Korea has between 2,500 and 5,000 tons of chemical agents. Does anyone on the panel think that a different number has some more credibility? Mr.
I think that number does not have credibility.
Because it's too low, it's too high, or you just have no idea?
Because it is simply a set of round numbers that somebody thought up at a point of time some years back.
Does anybody on the panel have any different estimate?
Would you like 12?
Any estimate that is an estimate rather than a, okay. If China were to end all banking and all trade except food and medicine, that is to say exporting food and medicine to North Korea, how big an effect would that have on the regime? Mr.
Well, I mean, the issue here is that they seem to be willing to do that for North Koreans, but if they're not willing to do that for their own nationals, aiding North Korea's sanctions evasion, then it will not have the impact.
I was saying if China used all of its devices to make sure that there wasn't a single dollar's worth of goods exported from North Korea to China, no coal, no whatever, no labor services, and actually enforced it, what effect would that have on the North Korean regime?
Well, I think it would have a substantial impact. I mean, the point I made earlier is that some of these examples we're seeing is a ledger system between China and North Korea where the money resides in China. And so what you're going to have is North Korea not have the ability to even go to another country for those items that they need.
Should we be more strong in our statements to Poland and others that have accepted North Korean workers, to use a euphemism? Mr. Baracchini?
So I think getting China to change on this is going to be an enduring challenge, but
It's not an enduring challenge. You just put a 50% tariff on all their exports to the United States and you will get their attention. But the enduring challenge is summoning the political will to do that in a system in which and obviously that would have an effect, but if you threaten to do it, they would concede. The reason we haven't threatened to do it is because of the tremendous power of corporations that on issues of national security. But please continue.
So I think there are costs and benefits of that type of economic
Well, if
management.
there are only benefits if China blinks.
But I think there is the opportunity to help other countries enforce the sanction network that's out there that can be in Poland.
Trim around the edges, yes. But Poland continues to have North Korean workers and insists upon doing that for another year and says that's a local rather than a national decision. Whether that's a violation of Section 5 of the NATO agreement in spirit, I don't know. Probably technically it isn't a violation of Section 5 de jure. We've sanctioned one small bank, Bank of Dandong. We haven't sanctioned any of the major Chinese banks because the economic powers in this country say we shouldn't do it. Last September, Chairman Royce identified several Chinese banks, including the China Merchants Bank and a state-owned bank, the Agricultural Bank of China, as doing sanctional business with North Korea. Chairman Yoho and I wrote to the Treasury Department writing several Chinese banks, including the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, the largest bank in the world, and the Bank of Communications, one of the largest banks in the world. The executive branch has failed to pull the trigger. Question is, why have we put preserving the $500 billion, $400 billion trade deficit with China and all the profits that generates above our national security? How do we get the administration to get serious with the big banks? Did someone have a yes?
Right. I mean, I would say, there was a narrative that North Korean financial activity was going through small Chinese banks, and that these medium and large banks were just a conduit. But FinCEN, an element of the Treasury Department, put out an advisory last year and said some of these accounts are actually at major Chinese financial institutions. So how do you do it? You do it with the regulatory fines. I guess, I would also, piggyback on the answer.
Well, you can do it, but how do you summon the political will to do it?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, these are mandatory sanctions, passed by Congress, the same as with
Nothing is
employing
illegal if 50 major businesses all decide it's the right policy. And just because we pass laws doesn't mean that the executive branch will follow them.
Right. I think this is stuck in a narrative, not this narrative, but a narrative about whether to do it between doing nothing and freezing their access to New York when there is this interim, what we talked about in terms of Iran sanctions using fines.
Well, I don't think you're that if you only do the level of economic effect that we had with Iran, this is a much more closed society, and a regime that cares even less about its own people. I think you're going to have much tougher sanctions if you're going to get even a freeze of their nuclear program, let alone the unrealistic goals that we at least claim that we're trying to achieve. I yield back.
Thank you for your comments, and that's why tomorrow we're going to do this special order on China to draw out some of these things and these inequities that they're doing so that the American people know this and members of Congress. Next, we'll go to Mr. Adam Kinzinger from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your leadership on this issue. Thank you all for being here for this very important subject. I think back, and I don't know if it's a good comparison. I think it is, to Neville Chamberlain coming back from his negotiations with Chancellor Hitler, and in a very difficult time, frankly, in Europe, understanding that they just came out of a major war, chewed up a generation with this prospect of another. They were understandably excited to talk about peace in our time. But I think looking back at that moment, it's not Neville Chamberlain that we celebrate as the hero of that era. It's a guy like Churchill who saw the gathering storm clouds. My hope is this does not turn into a kinetic exercise between the United States and North Korea. There's no doubt we would win, but nobody wants to go there. But I think what's important to note in all of this is that this is a real threat. In 1994, I think it was around then, when President Clinton was actually looking at options to bomb at North Korea because of this, Jimmy Carter pops up in Pyongyang and says he has an agreement. We're all excited. We take a deep sigh, take a nice sigh of relief, and we fixed the problem. And here we are today in 2018, looking down the barrel, frankly, of a gun. And I actually give the president a lot of props for having really brought this to the forefront. I know it makes people nervous. North Korea should make people nervous. This is a regime that is dead set on destabilizing our allies in the region, all in the goal of maintaining power. But I think we're going to have some very tough decisions to make here. I think if we go to a posture of saying we're going to just simply accept a nuclear North Korea, which is what some people, frankly, have advocated for, especially in the prior administration, and said we just need to build interceptors that can exceed their ability to launch nuclear weapons, I think that spells, in effect, the end of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty for the world. How are you ever going to confront Iran's nuclear ambitions if we just allowed North Korea? What's going to happen to every other rogue regime that decides they want nuclear weapons? We don't have the moral ability to confront them in this simply because we didn't with North Korea. So I think we have to take this extremely seriously. I think people that say the military option is absolutely off the table are doing very major damage to our diplomatic effort. As we all understand, instruments of power. The diplomatic instrument of power against an adversary does not work without the military instrument of power there to back it up. Otherwise, we can do all the sanctions we want, but if they don't think there is a stick, the carrot has no effect. Well, let me ask Mr. Perricini, I hope I said your name right. Given this threat, I think we're all clear-eyed to the fact that North Korea has the potential to sell WMDs to the highest bidder. That could be a rogue regime like Syria. Obviously, Assad has shown his desire to kill his own people, or even a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And it's no secret that North Korea provided assistance to Syria in building their nuclear reactor, which was destroyed in 2007. Given the situation in Syria now, I can't fathom how much worse it would be if Syria was a nuclear weapon state. Just because we haven't heard much about North Korea proliferation to other countries doesn't mean they still aren't interested in it. Can you speak to the level of interaction and potential WMD assistance that the Kim regime currently provides or is willing to provide to rogue regimes and non-state actors? What's their moral driver to prevent them from doing it, if in fact that's the answer? And which countries or groups seeking WMD assistance from North Korea should concern us the most?
Congressman, I think there's been a special relationship between North Korea and Syria for quite some time, which I think in part explains that relationship. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, which provided a lot of financing for Syrian purchases of conventional weapons and other capabilities, Iran has stepped in to kind of be that bank account. And the close relationship between Iran, Syria, and North Korea, I think, does explain some of the Assad regime's weapons purchases over the last decade, and indeed some of the collaboration on either its missile program, the reactor that you referred to that was destroyed, as well as chemical defenses. On non-state actors, there again, North Korea is in the trenches with Iran and Syria. That is, they see themselves as aligned to support Hamas and Hezbollah. But there is not evidence that they've actually transferred unconventional capabilities to non-state actors. Conventional weapons, yes. Assistance and guidance on tunneling, yes. But in terms of jumping the taboo that's on about states not transferring that, we have not seen that yet.
Do you have a fear that it could happen, potentially?
There is always that possibility, but given the power of these weapons, states are very reluctant to let them get out of control in that way. We feared that with Saddam Hussein, and in the end it proved not to be the case. Is there zero possibility? No, there's some possibility, but I think it's very low.
Thank you. And I'll just, since my time's up, I'll just say this without asking it. I think it's important that we look at utilizing the potential of boost phase intercept as well. I know this is something that's been discussed. It's inexpensive. Boost phase is the slowest launch phase of an ICBM, and I think it's imperative on the administration to also explore the idea of boost phase intercept as well. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for being here, and I yield back.
No, and I appreciate your line of questioning. That's brought up some great points. Next, we'll go to Ms. Dina Titus from Nevada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and ranking members, for holding this hearing today. With all due respect to my colleagues across the aisle, I think we do have to be concerned about the president's conflicting messages. One minute he's talking and bragging about having a bigger button than North Korea, and the next minute he's trying to take credit for bringing North Korea and South Korea together to talk about the Olympics. We just don't know what is coming out of the White House. He just now, a little while ago, gave an interview to Reuters in respect to the preemptive strike or a preemptive attack on North Korea, and this was his quote: "We're playing a very, very hard game of poker, and you don't want to reveal your hand." Well, this isn't a game, and I'm from Nevada. We know something about playing poker. There's also a tell when you play poker, and his tell is some of this braggadocio that he's always talking about when he's going to back down or not. I think that most of the questions and the attention has been on the nuclear threat, but I'm glad that we're talking about the non-nuclear threat as well. This is especially important in light of the Vancouver meeting and the false ballistic missile warning that kind of terrorized Hawaii just recently. So let me ask you, Ambassador Jenkins, during your time at the State Department when you were the coordinator for threat reduction programs, what was your office's greatest assets? What were you able to do to prevent some of the terrorism that we're talking about that's non-nuclear? And would you go on to say and tell us, now that that position is vacant, even though North Korea is such a big threat, they haven't bothered to fill that position, how are we going to address this?
Thank you for your question. The work that I was doing at the Department of State was really focusing on how to prevent WMD terrorism. And I also work closely with colleagues who are working on the nuclear issues. But my portfolio really did cover CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear issues. And most of the focus was on working amongst countries on how to deal with this issue, putting funds into all types of programs that would prevent WMD terrorism, whether it was nuclear security, whether it was biological security, whether it was border security issues, whether it was security culture issues with the scientists. So we really worked hard on those issues. The thing that's important is that the type of programs that I worked on, you would have to be working with a country that is open to those type of activities. So the type of activities that I was working on would not be useful, for, let's say, for North Korea right now, because they're not in a country that would be open to those kind of things. It's something that would happen later. But we were able to do quite a bit to reduce the chances of WMD terrorism around the world, because it's a global issue, it's a global problem, and we have quite a few countries that are working on it.
I think you also mentioned the cyber threat that North Korea poses. Maybe you could address that. I think there was a bulletin from DHS in June of 2017 that North Korea was targeting the U.S., targeting media, aerospace, financial. We don't know the level of sophistication, but do you think there's any possibility they could, like the Russians, target elections?
Well, I'm not an expert in cyber, so I can't really say with any authority whether they could do that or not. But apparently, North Korea does have some capabilities when it comes to cyber. So whether they could actually do what we're finding out that the Russians have done, I'm not sure, but they obviously are in the process of trying to strengthen their cyber capabilities.
Can anybody else address that?
I think that to have anything as broad as a major election would be beyond their current capabilities. But they have used cyber, at least in one case, to attack part of the power grid, or tried to in South Korea. They have conducted offensive cyber operations, and their capabilities are improving. But whether they would take on anything as broad as the U.S., I think that's certainly beyond their current capabilities.
I mean, I would just say that we shouldn't underestimate North Korea's cyber capabilities. I mean, it was only 4 years ago that they attacked Sony Pictures, and I think it's also easy to forget that when certain theaters said they were going to show the movie anyway, that North Korea threatened a 9/11 style attack against the United States. So North Korea has advanced its cyber capabilities. Now, whether they would want to impact an election, I think is more of a, that's not what they're going for. I think they're going for the ability to use cyber in a pre- and wartime environment, and you look at some of their activities in South Korea, and that's clear, but also to steal money to blunt the sanctions impact.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Next, we'll go to Ms. Ann Wagner from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being witnesses today. I appreciate your testimony. Mr. Quartersman, I really appreciated your thorough review of North Korea's weapon activities. It was very useful to the committee. Do you know to what extent U.S. bases in Northeast Asia have security measures in place to combat infectious or lethal agents?
I think you would have to get a briefing on detection at a different level because it's really, more than anything else now, the ability to characterize an attack that becomes the most critical issue. Your other problem is that when it comes down to what is the attack, there are so many different agents and so many different ways you can attack that there are at least some agents which, in an island context, an infectious agent or so on, where it would be extremely difficult for anyone to conduct a defensive measure other than treatment. And in that case, detecting the way in which the weapon was developed would be critical, because if it's altered to have a slow gestation period, which is now possible, it becomes a very difficult problem. I'm sure this issue is one that is being examined as part of a broader effort, but I think you're touching on some very sensitive issues.
Mr. Ruggiero, I appreciated your summary of how President Trump's diplomatic pressure has caused other countries to end relationships with North Korea. Are there countries partnering with North Korea that stand out to you as needing special attention from the administration?
Well, beyond China and
Yes.
Russia, and what was mentioned earlier was Poland. There's certainly still countries in Africa. I'm concerned about, even though Singapore has said that it will cut off its trade relationship with North Korea, I'm still concerned about the actual implementation of that. Malaysia has been an issue in the past. I think the question here is whether the administration is willing to use sanctions authorities to go after companies in friendly countries to show an impact. I think if they did that perhaps once or twice, that it could have an exponential impact.
I agree. Ambassador Jenkins, can you speak about the outcomes of yesterday's U.S.-Canada meeting in Vancouver on North Korea's illicit transfer of materials and equipment?
The one thing that I was able to pick up, and I need to get more information, is that there was an agreement by Canada to provide some funding to the U.S. to help with sanctions against North Korea. There was a pledge of $325 million, $3.25 million to help the U.S. with its sanctions, to help other countries with strengthening sanctions. So I don't think there was a lot of I don't know how much success there was in terms of bringing North Korea to the table, which is one of the things they wanted to do. And obviously there's thinking that by continuing the pressure on North Korea, that will bring them to the table, and this is another way to try to do that. But there was a lot of discussion on the sanctions and how to enforce the sanctions.
Great, thank you. It seems that U.S. policy prioritizes the challenge of the nuclear threat over the challenge of the chemical and biological weapons threat. Mr. Parashini, do you believe the U.S. government should work to change its, what I'll call, cost-benefit analysis and better prioritize the chemical and biological threats? And how do you think we begin to do that, sir?
So I think a focus on the nuclear threat is appropriate. It's a demonstrated capability that they've now also demonstrated a ballistic missile capability. So it's generally, it's in a category in and of to itself, where their chemical and biological weapons capabilities are at different thresholds. We don't have a good sense of what those thresholds may be. They're a greater threat, I think, in both South Korea and the Asian theater than they are to the homeland. So I think that naturally leads you to prioritize nuclear first. Their chemical capabilities are probably more robust based on what we know and based on the ease of producing those types of weapons, and their biological weapons are probably least available for use, and we know less about them. So I think I would prioritize those less. I would say if there are ways to do dual-use things for detection and addressing any infectious diseases, that's desirable to deal with, I think, the least probable of these threats.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. I thank you.
Thank you. Next, we'll go to Ms. Tulsi Gabbard from the state of Hawaii.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, at this point, I think no one more viscerally appreciates the seriousness of the threat that we face at this moment than the people of Hawaii, who just went through a terrifying experience on Saturday morning, receiving this alert on their cell phone that a ballistic missile was incoming. Take shelter immediately. This is not a drill. Now, obviously, we know now this turned out to be a colossal error on the part of the state officials responsible for this, but it really serves as a wake-up call to the country and to people in Washington about the imminent nature of the threat that we face and the need for urgent and effective action to ultimately remove this threat from our country. So, Mr. Ruggiero, you were talking about sanctions, and I know through a lot of the different questions, I think you gave responses coming at different angles. It's clear, though, that none of the sanctions that have been put in place over the last few decades against North Korea have proven effective, which is why we're sitting in this position, nor are they anywhere near, nor have they reached anywhere near the effectiveness of the sanctions in Iran that caused the nuclear deal to occur. Can you label maybe the top most effective changes to current sanctions that would actually prove this sanctions regime to be effective, to create this leverage?
Well, I can give you three. We talked about the China financial, so we don't have to go into much detail about that. We talked about the fines, and that would be useful. I would say the other benefit of the Vancouver meeting is something that I testified before this committee last year about, which is the public nature of a like-minded group. And we had that on Iran, and it looks like we now have that with Vancouver. And I think that one of the things in the statement was that they're going to meet more often. So that's the second thing. And the third, which is related to that, is shipping. Our research indicates that there are at least double, if not triple, of the number of North Korean linked vessels that can be and really should be sanctioned. And then also, we've already seen the South Koreans stop freeze or impound 2 vessels with regard to ship-to-ship transfers. That's an area that's going to need more work. And I think a lot of people don't want to interdict vessels, but we need to remember the value of just doing training exercises with regard to interdicting vessels as well, doing those in a more public way to increase the costs for some of these vessels that may not know that they're involved with North Korea.
Is anyone else? With regard to, there's been some conversation, especially lately, about the possibility of a quote-unquote preventive or preemptive strike. And I'm wondering what actual defense treaties are in place between China and North Korea and Russia and North Korea, respectively, and what you believe their responses would be from the spectrum of a surgical strike that some are advocating for all the way to an overwhelming military strike coming from the United States. How would China and Russia react to that?
There is no automatic treaty relationship between China and North Korea, but there is a broad security relationship and treaty or agreement. I think that when you talk about how China would react, any kind of bolt from the blue, just preemptive attack without a cause, would almost force China to react, at least diplomatically, and take a very strong political stand. I doubt very much if it would lead to immediate military action, but it would be extremely hard to predict. I think.
Would you agree that North Korea would respond with military action in that instance?
I think that certainly it would respond with some kind of military action, but whether that action would be something that would offset the impact of a really well-targeted preventive strike, a lot would depend on how well we can actually target preventively and locate and destroy their nuclear capabilities, and how many other things we would do to restrict their retaliatory capability. There's a very wide range between simply trying to strike their nuclear weapons and what could be a major conflict.
Thank you.
I might add that it's very dangerous to think about decapitation because you don't know whether or not this is a regime that has a dead hand doctrine. That is, when the leadership goes out, some other parts of the military know that it's time for them to go in. And indeed, that was a Soviet doctrine. It is a reasonable worry that North Korea may have a similar one. So any type of decapitation attempt, successful or not, might launch something that we really would not like to have occur.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your questioning. Next, we'll go to Mr. Tom Garrett from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start with Ambassador Jenkins because, Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you're aware, but Ambassador Jenkins went to our nation's premier flagship public university, the University of Virginia, for one of her degrees. So I know she's going to have a good answer here. To your knowledge, Ambassador Jenkins, is there any other nation on the face of the planet circa 2018 that literally sells workers to do work in foreign countries and then has their salaries remitted to the government of that nation?
I'm taking my time on this one just to think. I don't think so.
I don't either, and I point that out not because it's directly on point, but because I think it's relevant for those who are trying to understand the nature of this regime. My opening statement, Mr. Chair, I tried to illustrate that any regime that would sell its very own people into slavery might be willing to utilize weapons of any variety, be they conventional, nuclear, biological, or chemical, against not only foreigners, but their own citizens. And I also think it's worthy of note that the history in the region indicates hostilities inherent over intergenerational periods between not just the North and the South, but also the Japanese and the Koreans, the Chinese and the Koreans, et cetera. And I think most Americans fail to understand that. Moving somewhat, Dr. Cordesman, dual purpose improved conventional munitions, submunitions, bomblets. Do we know whether or not the North Korean regime employs artillery, cannon, rocket, or missile systems that might employ submunitions? I mean, I know the answer, but
I have not heard that they have extensive stocks of advanced submunitions, but I think that from some of the literature I have seen from IHS, Janes, and others, there are indications they have at least some capabilities in these areas.
And the unclassified documentation indicates that a launcher loader worth of dual-purpose improved conventional munitions on the proper mathematical firing solution would be able to essentially impact every single unprotected target in a single square kilometer. So again, these references to 20,000 dead in one day, I would submit rhetorically, are probably low, particularly when you consider populations not hardened, densely compacted in civilian areas. Now, does the United States employ dual-purpose improved conventional munitions by doctrine?
We have a range of advanced artillery rounds, yes.
But did we not remove ourselves voluntarily from the...
Yes.
And that would have been circa 2015.
Right.
And so also we've made reference to, and you made reference to, hardened artillery emplacements. Essentially, in theory, these artillery emplacements might roll from out from underneath of protective overhead cover, et cetera, fire, and then move back in. Is that accurately characterized some of our understanding of the North Korean indirect fire capability?
They vary sharply according to the terrain. Some do that, some can fire and do fire from fixed positions.
And so we voluntarily stopped using scatterable submunitions that might counter these in a counter-battery scenario. How about area denial munitions, Rams and Adams, artillery-fired area denial munitions? Do we have those in our capability, and do we have those in our inventory in the United States?
I know we have them in our capability and had them in our capability. Quite frankly, I do not know the inventories involved.
In fact, we voluntarily removed ourselves from the realm of nations that would employ scatterable area denial munitions. Have the North Koreans done this?
No.
And so might these withdrawals of the United States from the arena of cutting-edge weaponry put us at a competitive disadvantage with a regime that hasn't honored the same commitments that we've made?
If I may make 2 points. First, we have basically gone to using the equivalent of earth penetrators rather than submunitions because of the blast doors on the hearts. That is a very restricted capability, but it requires you to penetrate a much more serious barrier than the artillery rounds we then had.
So specifically in the case of a hardened target, the earth penetrator might be a preferred method. However, if you're trying to deny a roll-in, roll-out artillery system, the scatterable mines might be something that would work best. Let me continue because I got about 20 seconds remaining. It strikes me that the people who entered this country into these agreements probably never did comprehensive fires planning for offensive or defensive operations. And it strikes me, and I apologize again, with all due respect, sir, and I have an immense amount for yourself and other members of this panel, that we endanger the very lives of the young women and men who've signed on a dotted line to potentially sacrifice everything that they have or ever will have for the freedom of this nation and the defense of the innocent peoples, not only of South Korea, but the world. And so I take this opportunity, Mr. Chairman, and I'll conclude shortly, to submit that we might relook some of the treaties into which we entered and some of the actions we unilaterally engaged in light of the very real circumstances in which we find ourselves 24 years post a North Korean nuclear deal that was to, in the words of the President, who shouted from the mountaintops his success, rid the Korean Peninsula of a nuclear threat. It is indeed existential to the young men and women in our uniforms and in the people not only of the region of the world, but of the world. Thank you.
Well spoken. I appreciate your words. Next, Ms. Norma Torres from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. Mr. Regaria, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Last year, I introduced H.R. 3261, the North Korea Follow the Money Act. It's a simple bipartisan bill that requires a national intelligence estimate on North Korea's revenue sources. How much do we know about how North Korea is funding its chemical weapons programs?
Well, I would just say that a lot of our understanding of North Korea's finances is very anecdotal, partially because North Korea does not report its own trade statistics, partially because some trade statistics that are reported as North Korea are actually South Korea, and then also because the Chinese report what they want to report. And to the question of, perhaps the question of, whether having an assessment of that type of the budget and the usefulness of that, I would say, sanctions are now being used more and more often, especially when it comes to North Korea, and I think it would be valuable, at least internally within the U.S. government, to have a common understanding of where North Korea is now and what are the levers that can be used to affect different revenue streams.
Specifically, if we want to be very specific and target certain people versus an entire country, correct?
Well, the issue here, there's always been this narrative of leadership assets overseas. That's certainly something that I know that the government has focused on before. And as I noted earlier, the North Koreans use their revenue really in three ways: military, weaponization, weapons, and for the elites. And I think if we had an understanding of what the budget is like, but it will always be imprecise, but a way to target the sanctions to go in certain areas and to not harm the people, I think, is the first order there.
Absolutely. That's why I think it's critical for us to, at the very least, Mr. Chairman, try to get a hearing on this bill. Once again, H.R. 3261. I'm also very concerned about an incident that occurred June of 2017, a cyber attack that shut down our nation's ports. The Port of Los Angeles was impacted. That is a concern to me because the livelihood of my constituents is dependent on the activities at the ports. Do you think that North Korea has the capability to carry out cyber attacks against our ports and other critical infrastructure?
Well, I would say that if they don't have the capability now, they're going to certainly work toward getting it. I think what we see in South Korea over the last 5 to 6 years, where North Korea used cyber to attack U.S. forces Korea and our South Korean counterparts in a wide approach, and then learned from that and was more specific. In other words, going after 20 websites the first time, and then the second time going after only 2. So I think that's part of it, the wartime environment, using it in a wartime environment, but then using it, what we like to call cyber-enabled economic warfare, to try and harm the United States as these sanctions increase. And then the third way is to make money to blunt the impact of those sanctions.
Go ahead, Ms. Jennings.
Yes, I would just add that I think the more effective the international community is in terms of sanctions, in terms of interdiction of illicit trafficking of materials and equipment, the more likely North Korea will rely on cyber to raise the funds that they need to do what they need to do. And in doing that, they will develop a capability to use it for other things. So there is a connection between the effectiveness of activities to prevent them from doing what they're doing and to prevent them from raising the money that they want to raise, and their use on this other tool to raise that money.
So either stealing from us, directly from us, or shutting down our commerce. What can we do to protect ourselves? Yes, sir.
I think that really is a key question. An awful lot of the problem we face is the failure basically to provide basic defenses, reduce cyber vulnerability, set standards that do not allow ease of attack. When countries like North Korea can attack a critical infrastructure function, the question is, why is it vulnerable in the first place?
Thank you. I ran out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I appreciate your participation and your questions. And the panelists, thank you for your endurance, your information that you've given us. What I see is the continuing evolution of the North Korean saga, going from the Korean War to where we're at today. And we've seen past administrations, both Republican and Democrats, use the carrot and stick. And at each point, Korea got stronger in far as their development. I have a hard time believing they did this on their own. I feel there was a lot of help, whether it was from Pakistan in the beginning, to Russia, to China, to other actors, and they're used as a proxy state in a lot of these ventures. But now they're at a point where they are today. And I think you just brought up a point about defensive mechanisms. And I look at the THAAD system South Korea put in that was so warranted at the time, but I saw China retaliate against South Korea. South Korea was doing that just for their protection, and I think they were very warranted to bring in the other ones, and again, at the dismay and dissatisfaction of China. But I think it's very important, and I think we as a nation should make sure that offer stands on the table as something that South Korea can use to make sure that they have the defensive mechanisms. But this is, of course, up to the South Koreans, and we're at a different point now with the talks that are going on between the two Koreas. We can just hope that with the efforts of the world community coming together, putting pressure on all partners that are trading with North Korea, that this will come to a peaceful resolution. I can't thank you enough for being here. Do you have any other further comments you want to say, or you feel pretty confident with what's gone on? Hearing no other comments, I want to thank the witnesses, I want to thank the members, and I want to thank Judge Poe for calling this important meeting jointly together with the Asia Pacific Subcommittee. In his absence, I would like to end it with, and that's the way it is. This meeting's adjourned.